This is breaking news. Steve Cropper, one of the most influential guitarists, songwriters, and producers in the history of American music, has died at the age of 84. His family confirmed that he passed away peacefully on December 3rd in Nashville, surrounded by loved ones. No cause of death has been revealed, and the family is asking for privacy as tributes pour in from around the world. For more than 6 decades, Cropper was the silent architect behind the sound of modern soul and rhythm and blues. He wasn't a showman. He didn't need pyrotechnics or 10-minute solos. Instead, he built a legacy through timing, tone, and precision, proving that sometimes the most powerful guitar line is the one that says the most with the fewest notes. Today's news has stunned the global music community. Artists from every generation are honoring him as the backbone of Stax Records, the co-writer of classics like Knock on Wood, In the Midnight Hour, and The Immortal, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, and the quiet guitar hero who stood center stage in the Blues Brothers, even while never chasing fame. But to understand why this loss feels so enormous, we must go back to the beginning, to the journey of a boy from rural Missouri, to the rise of a young guitarist who transformed Memphis soul, and to the final peaceful chapter of a man whose music will outlive us all. Steve Cropper's journey began far from the crowded studios and neon stages where his music would one day echo. Born on October 21, 1941, on a quiet farm in Dora, Missouri, he grew up in an environment shaped by hard work, steady routines, and the kind of silence that leaves room for imagination. His father, Hollis Cropper, worked for the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, while his mother, Grace Atkins, taught school. A family grounded in discipline and simplicity. Everything changed when he was 9. The Croppers moved to Memphis, a city alive with gospel choirs, street corner blues, and the earliest sparks of soul music. For many kids, Memphis was noisy and overwhelming. For Steve, it was a revelation. The city's soundtrack, guitars bending through blues, licks, singers belting gospel harmonies, radio stations blending genres without rules, became the foundation of his future. At 14, he ordered his first guitar through the mail. That single moment shifted the trajectory of his life. He practiced relentlessly, absorbing influences that would ultimately shape his unique voice. The elegant precision of Chet Atkins, the jazz sophistication of Tal Farlow, the raw, emotional bite of Loman Pauling from the Five Royales. These influences didn't clash. They fused, forming a style defined by clarity, rhythm, and restraint. By high school, Cropper had already stepped into Memphis music scene. With his friend Donald "Duck" Dunn, he formed the Royal Spades, a band that rehearsed every chance they could, playing with a maturity far beyond their age. It wasn't fame they were chasing. It was the groove. And soon, that groove would lead them straight into the doorway of a rundown old movie theater on Macklemore Avenue, the future home of Stax Records, and the place where Steve Cropper's life would change forever. When Steve Cropper first walked into the converted movie theater on Macklemore Avenue, the building that would soon become Stax Records, he didn't arrive as a star. He came as a teenager willing to do anything. Sweep floors, move gear, watch sessions, learn silently. But even then, people around him sensed something different. He listened closer, played cleaner, understood space in a way most guitarists never do. Stax wasn't a typical record label. It was raw, unpredictable, and fueled entirely by instinct. Artists came in without maps, and together they built the Memphis sound one take at a time. Cropper fit perfectly into that world. He didn't try to stand out. He tried to make everything around him better. By 1961, the Royal Spades had evolved into the Marquis, and the band scored a national hit with Last Night. Overnight, Cropper went from local guitarist to a young player with a growing reputation. But instead of chasing fame on the road, he stayed in the studio, a decision that would define his entire legacy. Inside Stax, he became the backbone of nearly everything the label created. He played on and helped shape tracks from Rufus Thomas, Carla Thomas, William Bell, and countless others. Producers trusted him. Artists leaned on his instincts. His guitar wasn't flashy. It was essential, the glue holding every groove. Together, Stax's house band eventually crystallized into the group that would change American soul forever. Booker T. and the MGs. The lineup: Booker T. Jones on organ, Al Jackson Jr. on drums, Louis Steinberg on bass, and Steve Cropper on guitar, represented something deeper than music. At a time when racial tension shaped the country, the band blended black and white musicians working as one. Their unity became part of their sound. They were tight, rhythmic, precise. Every note mattered. And it was during one leftover session, a moment no one expected, that they created the track that would put them on the global map. Green Onions. Booker T. started with a rising organ riff. Al Jackson locked in the beat. Steinberg added the bass line. And Cropper, with his 1956 Fender Esquire, dropped crisp, perfectly timed chords that sliced through the mix. No overplaying, no ego, just pure, instinctive groove. Radio DJs flipped the single to its B-side, and the world changed. Green Onions wasn't just a hit. It became one of the most recognizable instrumental tracks of the entire 20th century. From that moment on, Stax was no longer just a studio. It was a movement. And behind that movement stood a young guitarist whose greatest strength was knowing exactly what not to play. Green Onions was never meant to be a defining moment. It wasn't planned. It wasn't polished. It was born from leftover studio time, the kind musicians usually use just to unwind. But sometimes, lightning strikes when no one is looking. And that August afternoon in 1962, lightning struck hard. The session earlier that day with rockabilly singer Billy Lee Riley had gone nowhere. The band stayed behind, simply playing to shake off the frustration. Booker T. Jones slid into a casually hypnotic organ groove. Al Jackson Jr. matched him with a drum pattern that felt effortless but unbreakable. Louis Steinberg dropped a bass line that bounced with confidence. And Steve Cropper? He answered them with the cleanest, sharpest rhythm guitar imaginable, those clipped, precise chords on his '56 Fender Esquire cutting through the air with absolute authority. His playing was like punctuation. Not too much, never too little, always exactly right. They named the track Green Onions without much thought. Sounded cool. That was enough. But when the single hit radio stations, DJs did something unusual. They flipped it over. Instead of playing the intended A-side, they played the raw, improvised B-side. And listeners erupted. The groove was irresistible, gritty, confident, and unlike anything on the airwaves. Within weeks, Green Onions became a national hit. Within months, it became a cultural landmark. Across decades, it would appear in films, TV shows, commercials, sports events, and playlists. Everywhere. A permanent fixture in American sound. And suddenly, the quiet teenager who once swept floors at Stax wasn't just a studio helper anymore. He was part of the band that had just rewritten what an instrumental hit could sound like. But Green Onions was only the beginning. Steve Cropper's greatest masterpieces, the songs that would define soul music forever, were still ahead. In late 1967, Otis Redding arrived at Stax with a new idea brewing. Something gentler, more reflective, a shift from his explosive signature sound. He brought melodic fragments and lyrical sketches inspired by time spent on the San Francisco Bay. And he turned to Steve Cropper, the collaborator who understood him best. Together, they reshaped the pieces into a fully formed mood, introspective, soulful, and quietly revolutionary. Then tragedy struck. Just days after recording the song's main vocals, Otis Redding died in a plane crash. The news devastated Stax, and the responsibility of finishing the record fell to Cropper. He returned to the studio alone, adding guitar textures, arranging the whistles, shaping the final mix, carefully preserving Otis's vision without altering its emotional truth. When the song was released 1 month later, it went straight to #1. Dock of the Bay wasn't just a hit. It became a farewell, a gentle, timeless monument to the partnership between Otis and Cropper, etched into the very fabric of American music. Knock on Wood, Electricity in the Studio, co-written with Eddie Floyd during a storm in Memphis. Knock on Wood crackled with urgency from the moment it was conceived. Lightning struck outside, and the tension found its way into the melody. A bold, powerful R&B anthem. Cropper's guitar provided the backbone. Simple, strong, unmistakable. The track soared to #1 on the R&B charts and became one of the most covered soul songs of all time. In the midnight hour, reinventing the groove. With Wilson Pickett, Cropper co-wrote In the Midnight Hour, a song built around a subtle rhythmic innovation, the delayed backbeat. Instead of landing exactly on the beat, the snare hit came a fraction of a moment later, creating a looser, deeper, infectious groove. That tiny shift changed R&B forever. The song topped the charts, influenced a generation of musicians, and solidified Cropper as not just a guitarist, but a sonic architect. These 3 songs alone would be enough to define a lifetime. But for Steve Cropper, they were only one chapter in a career that kept evolving even as the music industry changed around him. By 1971, Stax Records was no longer the creative sanctuary it had once been. The label had grown rapidly, and with growth came business complications, distribution conflicts, and rising financial pressure. The atmosphere that had once felt like family slowly shifted into something more corporate, more unpredictable. For a decade, Steve Cropper had been at the center of nearly everything Stax produced. His fingerprints were on almost every major recording from 1961 through 1970. But the magic that had defined the early years, the spontaneous sessions, the collaborative spirit, the shared hunger to create something new, had begun to fade. Cropper sensed it, and in his quiet, decisive way he made a choice. He left. Walking away from Stax was not a dramatic exit. There were no fights, no public statements. He simply moved toward the next chapter. A chapter where countless artists were already waiting for him. Because by the early 70s, Steve Cropper was no longer just a guitarist. He was the guitarist that singers, bands, and producers trusted. John Lennon called. So did Rod Stewart, Dolly Parton, Etta James, Ringo Starr. They wanted the precision, the instinct, and the understated genius that had made Cropper one of the most respected musicians of his generation. He moved to Los Angeles in 1975, expanding his work as a producer and studio collaborator. His sound, once rooted deeply in the Stax building on Macklemore Avenue, now carried across genres, coasts, and musical styles. And then, in the late 1970s, a completely unexpected opportunity arrived. One that would introduce him to an entirely new audience and transform him from a studio legend into a pop culture icon. By the late 1970s, Steve Cropper was already revered inside the industry, a musician's musician. But what happened next would catapult him into a different kind of fame, the kind that reached audiences who had never heard of Stax, Memphis Soul, or the MGs. It started on Saturday Night Live. Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi were developing their blues-loving alter egos, Jake and Elwood Blues. The characters were funny, but the music needed to be real, authentic enough to honor the genre they loved. And to do that, they needed the players who built its foundation. They called Steve Cropper. Alongside Donald "Duck" Dunn, Cropper joined the Blues Brothers band, and instantly, the group gained musical legitimacy. His presence wasn't loud or theatrical. It didn't need to be. The steady confidence in his posture, the clipped precision of his chords, the unmistakable tone of his guitar. It grounded the entire band. Then came the moment that cemented his place in pop culture. The Blues Brothers, 1980. A film that blended comedy, chaos, and some of the greatest soul performances ever captured on screen. There he stood, playing himself, Steve the Colonel Cropper. Calm, observant, laser-focused, the same energy he had always brought to every studio session. For millions of viewers around the world, this was the first time they saw the face behind the sound they already knew. Kids who had never heard of Stax suddenly recognized the man with the Esquire. The film became a worldwide phenomenon. And after John Belushi's passing in 1982, many assumed the band would fade. Instead, the musicians, including Cropper, continued performing, touring, and keeping the spirit of the Blues Brothers alive. For Cropper, this era was more than a resurgence. It was validation, proof that his influence extended far beyond the walls of a recording studio. His guitar lines weren't just part of history, they were part of global culture. Through the 80s, 90s, and well into the 2000s, he continued collaborating with major artists, performing live and contributing to projects that needed the unmistakable touch only he could bring. But even with all the acclaim, one truth remained unchanged. Steve Cropper never chased fame. He chased the groove. Even as the decades passed, Steve Cropper never drifted away from music. He simply moved at his own rhythm, steady, focused, and deliberate. While many artists of his era slowed down or stepped away from the spotlight entirely, Cropper kept creating, performing, and refining his craft with the same quiet discipline that defined his youth. He collaborated extensively throughout the 1990s and 2000s, working with musicians who admired both his sound and his integrity. Ringo Starr, Paul Simon, and Elton John were among the many artists who sought him out, knowing exactly what he brought to a session: clarity, instinct, and absolute respect for the song. And even late in life, he continued adding new chapters to his legacy. In 2024, he released Friendly Town, an album that surprised many with its energy, confidence, and unmistakable Cropper signature. It wasn't a nostalgic project. It wasn't an attempt to recreate the past. It was the work of an artist who still believed he had something worth saying, and who insisted on saying it with precision. That same year, he appeared in the HBO docuseries Stax, Soulsville, USA, reflecting on the label that shaped him and the era that reshaped American music. His commentary wasn't dramatic or self-centered. It was thoughtful, measured, exactly what listeners had come to expect from him. In an interview with Total Guitar in 2024, he summarized his entire artistic philosophy in one line: "I don't release junk. I'm happy with it. No regrets." For a man who never chased trends, never compromised, and never played a note he didn't believe in, it was the perfect statement. But the most defining chapter, the final one, was still ahead. In the final years of his life, Steve Cropper lived with the same quiet discipline that defined his music. Nashville had been his home since 1988, a place where he balanced creativity with privacy, and where he could step away from the noise of the industry whenever he wished. Friends often described visiting him and finding a guitar resting within arm's reach. Even in his 80s, he played daily. Not to prepare for tours, not for fame. Simply because music had always been his truest language. His later days unfolded gently. No dramatic final. Appearances, no public health battles. Just the familiar rhythm of family life. Time with his wife Angel. Conversations with his children Stephen, Ashley, Cameron Andrea, and the steady comfort of the city he loved. For Cropper, this peace was not retirement. It was fulfillment, the natural destination of a life lived without shortcuts, ego, or compromise. On December 3, 2025, Steve Cropper passed away peacefully in Nashville. His family chose not to disclose the cause of death, asking instead for understanding and privacy, a request that perfectly matched the way he had always carried himself. In their public message, his family emphasized that his music had touched millions of people and that his influence would continue to live on through every note he ever recorded. They asked for understanding and privacy as they grieved, reflecting the quiet, dignified way he had always carried himself. Across the music world, the news landed with a quiet shock. This wasn't just the loss of a guitarist. It was the farewell of a man whose restraint defined an era, whose fingerprint lies on some of the greatest recordings in history. Peaceful ending, a lasting echo, and a legacy that will continue long after the final chord fades. Steve Cropper leaves behind more than a catalog of hits. He leaves behind the blueprint of an entire genre. His guitar defined the sharp, understated groove of Memphis soul. His songwriting shaped the emotional language of 60s R&B. His work with Booker T. and the MGs set a new standard for rhythm sections. And his partnership with Otis Redding produced one of the most enduring recordings of the 20th century. Yet what made Cropper truly unique was his philosophy. He never tried to dominate a song. He built his legacy on restraint, on knowing exactly what to play, and just as importantly, what not to play. This clarity, this sense of purpose, is what allowed his music to cross generations, cultures, and styles. From Stax Records to the Blues Brothers and beyond, his sound became part of global culture. His chords appear in films, commercials, sporting events, and playlists decades after they were recorded. His influence can be heard in guitarists who may not even know they're imitating him, because Cropper's style has become part of the language of modern music itself. The world has lost a quiet architect, a master craftsman, a true original. But his music will continue doing what it always did, speaking softly and staying forever. Play it, Steve. If this story moved you, remember to like the video and subscribe for more in-depth tributes to the legends who shaped our world. Share your favorite Steve Cropper moment in the comments. Every memory helps keep his spirit alive. And explore our Last Moments playlist for more stories behind the icons.